Now, please take out your Bibles and we'll pick up in our study on the songs of our faith. We're in Psalm 39. And as you're turning, let me just give you a heads up on where we're going over the next several weeks. Now, the book of Psalms has 150 different songs to it. People have asked, are you going to go through the whole 150? And I'll say, whoops, I'm getting excited here. Yes, at some point, I'd love to see us work our way through the book. But instead of doing it all at once, the book is divided into 5 major sections, or 5 separate books, they're called. And so the first collection or book within the book of Psalms is Psalm 1 through Psalm 41. And so we're going to go through Psalm 41, and then when we hit Psalm 41, after that, we're going to take a pause, and then I'm going to go through the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. When we finish that, and we'll start that in February, and when we finished 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, then we'll come back to the book of Psalms and do the second major section. And then we'll take a pause and do another book and keep coming back. So if I were to preach right through the book of Psalms, it would take, honestly, about 5 years. So what I'm actually doing now is working out my retirement plan. So for the next 20 years, we're going to be going through the rest of the Psalms and whatever books in between, all right? But that's how we're going to do it. In February, we'll take a break from Psalms and do a book study in the New Testament. Then we'll come back. All right, this morning, though, we're in Psalm 39, one of the most powerful teaching songs that we're going to study. It's so simple, so basic for every one of us. David writes, I said, I will watch my ways and keep my tongue from sin. I will put a muzzle on my mouth while in the presence of the wicked. So I remained utterly silent, not even saying anything good. But my anguish increased. My heart grew hot within me. While I meditated, the fire burned. And then I spoke with my tongue. Show me, Lord, my life's end and the number of my days. Let me know how fleeting my life is. You have made my days a mere handbreadth. The span of my years is as nothing before you. Everyone is but a breath, even those who seem secure. Surely, everyone goes around like a mere phantom. In vain, they rush about, heaping up wealth without knowing whose it will finally be. But now, Lord, what do I look for? My hope is in you. Save me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of fools. I was silent. I would not open my mouth, for you are the one who has done this. Remove your scourge from me. I am overcome by the blow of your hand. When you rebuke and discipline anyone for their sin, you consume their wealth like a moth. Surely everyone is but a breath. Hear my cry, Lord. Listen to my cry for help. Do not be deaf to my weeping. I dwell with you as a foreigner, a stranger, as all my ancestors were. Look away from me, that I may enjoy life again before I depart and am no more. And the song ends. As we've been going through all of these songs, before we jump into the meat of the song, I like to share some observations that make these songs unique. And this morning, as we're looking at Psalm 39, there are 3 general observations that I'd like to share with you. It gives you a little bit of a bigger context for how to understand this song. The first observation that I would share with you is that many Bible scholars believe that this is a companion song. We've talked about companion songs a lot. Songs that were written to either conclude another song or written about the same occasion. They're marching to war and they're going to sing one song. They come back victorious. They sing the next. Or sometimes companion songs are combined by theme, like those wonderful messianic songs that we saw in Psalm 22, 23, and 24. And in Psalm 39, David uses some identical words and phrases that we find in Psalm 38. And so many commentators believe that he either wrote it at the same time or about the same circumstances. Now, I'll personally just share with you that while there are clear similarities between Psalm 38 and 39, I don't personally believe that it's a companion song, that they were intended to be written or read together. They're similar. And David is going through some pain and dealing with some sin issues, but I think the thrust of Psalm 39 is very different at its heart than what we find in Psalm 38. But regardless of whether you think Psalm 38 and 39 are companion songs or not, everyone clearly agrees that the second observation is that this is a didactic teaching or contemplative song. In fact, this is so important that as David is sharing some of the teaching points in this, he writes a word in that's translated with our word Selah, and it's right after verse 5 and verse 11 that we find these terms, and they are kind of musical terms, if you will, that simply mean pause. From a teaching perspective, you would use this term to say, okay, stop for a moment and think about this. Consider how this point applies to your life and makes a difference today. And so very clearly, David is writing this song to share with us. In fact, this is so important as a teaching song that at the turn of the century, of the 20th century, there was a pastor and a Bible scholar named Arno Gaebelein who shared out of all of the songs that we find written in the Psalm book, if you read this psalm, Psalm 39, frequently, it'll bring a special blessing to your heart and life. And he's writing that because of the specific teaching points that David makes about what it means to have a healthy, prosperous spiritual life. So, it's a companion song, it's a contemplative teaching song, but here's another thing that makes it so important. This is a corporate song. A lot of times you might look at something and say, this means something to me personally. Or maybe somebody wrote in their diary or their devotional journal, and it wasn't intended to share with everybody. But David has taken a very important teaching moment in his life, and we know that this was intended for corporate worship like the rest of the Psalms, but specifically this one has in its heading to give to Jeduthun. Now, we know from the Old Testament books that Jeduthun was one of the three worship leaders, chief worship leaders, that were appointed to oversee the temple worship and put all of this together. And so it's as if the Holy Spirit gave it to David. David wrote all this down and then wrote and said, get this over to Jeduthun because I want this to be included in the hymn book of the temple. Now, this is really interesting because sometimes, just like we sing different songs with different tones or moods, sometimes we sing upbeat praise songs and celebration songs, and sometimes we have songs that are quieter, more contemplative or meditative. The same thing happens in the book of Psalms. You have some that are really high and celebrating and just exaltation oriented, but this isn't one of those. This is one that's just a little bit more serious in the sense that it's something that God has given us to just say, here, read this, understand it, study it, meditate on it, because it'll change your life. It'll change your life. As you look at the English translation, there are very clearly 4 sections to Psalm 39. They show up in verses 1 through 3, 4 through 6, 7 through 11, and 12 and 13. You see the clear divisions. There's a space between those. So we know those are strophes or sections. And each one of them has an interesting element to that. In the first strophe or section, we have the introduction or the circumstances in which David finds himself and why he's writing. Then he deals with 3 issues that relate to our spiritual lives. The first issue in the second section, verses 4 through 6, is dealing with the brevity of life. The second teaching issue in verses 7 through 11 deals with the problem of sin in our lives. The third teaching section in verses 12 and 13 deal with the eternal focus of our lives. Look, the issues that David is writing about 3,000 years ago are no different than the issues that you and I have to deal with every day in our own lives. Sometimes we have this idea that, oh, David lived so long ago, and I'm not even sure he was a real character. I just read about him, and we feel so disconnected by time. Sometimes we feel disconnected because a guy like David, oh man, he was a man after God's own heart. How would he know what it is to struggle with some of the issues? But let me tell you, as David was writing, there's one theme to this song that is central to every single person who has ever lived, whether it's David, you and me, or anyone else. And that is simply the question, how do we live spiritually productive lives? How do we have a healthy, productive spiritual life that's filled with a sense of glory, of joy, of peace? We're moving forward. We're being used by God. David wrestled with that issue just like you and I do. And let me make this clear. When you're in those moments where you're going, oh man, that was 3,000 years ago, and how does he really understand and relate? Folks, David was a man who, just like every one of us, struggles with living in two. There's this dynamic clash in David's life, just like ours. He struggles with living in the world of man while wanting to be a man of God. It's no different today than it was back then. How do you, day after day after day, live in the world of man and want to be a man or a woman of God? That's what this song is all about. How to wrestle through these issues that you and I have to address every single day so that you and I can experience this full, productive, healthy spiritual life that is so fulfilling that without it, man, we're a mess. So David begins by writing about the circumstances of the moment. And it's almost as if we're stepping into the middle of a situation. David is like in a room filled with ungodly people who are laughing and they're making fun of God and they're doing all this stuff that represents pride, arrogance, self-driven, self-oriented life. All this stuff that's so important to them that has no eternal meaning, no eternal significance. And David is just taking all of this in, listening. One writer, because this writer believed that David was really writing Psalm 31 or Psalm 39 as an extension of 38. Says, oh, David's going through all this emotional stuff right now. He's frustrated. He's angry. He's almost in shock about what's going on in his life. And I don't think that that's the case at all. I think if David's in shock, he's in shock because he's looking at the ungodly, listening to them, and all the laughter and all the jokes and all the stuff that they're pursuing. And he's shocked that people are wasting their lives the way they do. Are you kidding? And inside, he says, man, I was there, I was listening, I was watching. And John Calvin makes an interesting observation, the great reformer. He says, you know, when a dog barks when his master is being attacked, and I would be a coward if I saw the ungodly attacking God's character, God's truth, the people of God. I would be a coward if God was being attacked by the ungodly and I didn't say a thing. If a dog at least barks, shouldn't I say anything? And David is wrestling with that same issue. He says, I was listening to this. I was watching all of this. I said, I'm not going to speak at all. I'm just going to muzzle my mouth in the presence of the wicked. In fact, he says, I was so silent that I didn't say anything bad or even good. I was just taking it all in. And wow. But then something's happening. As he's there, he's listening, he's watching, he's trying to keep quiet. He says, but my anguish, my frustration increased. Inside, my heart's getting hot. I'm getting upset while I'm meditating. I'm on fire. I got to say something. And he says, that's it. That's it. It's time to talk. Okay. He says, here's what I've learned from God. Listening to all of your silliness, watching all of your garbage go on. And now, in the rest of the song, he says, look, all of this stuff that you guys, the ungodly, are talking about, all that stuff they're pursuing, it has absolutely no ultimate eternal benefit. There's no joy, no fulfillment in it. He says, if you want to be a God follower, that's where the real life is. And then he presents for us 3 simple steps. You know, it's so interesting. You go through all these discipleship books and, they're step after step after step, 20 steps to this or that. And he says, you want to understand spirituality? You want to understand what a whole productive and healthy Christian life looks like, or a God life looks like? This is it. And he reduces it all down to 3 simple things. He says, first, you have to remember the brevity of life. You have to remember how short life is in verses 4 through 6. Then second, you have to deal with the sin issues in your life in verses 7 through 13. And then finally, you have to have an eternal focus in verse 12. Now, it's interesting. You have those sections, and each one of them are very clearly in our Bible and separated by a gap. But rather than dealing with them chronologically as it's written, there really isn't a cookie-cutter kind of clean thing. They're woven together a little bit. So that, yes, the brevity of life is the primary focus of verses 4 through 6, but it bleeds into the rest. Dealing with the sin issues is the primary focus, an argument of verses 7 through 13, but it bleeds out into the other. And it goes all the way to verse 13 at the end, but tucked right in the middle of all of that in verse 12 is this simple statement that helps us understand his eternal focus. So we're going to address this morning by looking at these teaching points as David wrote them topically. Saying, if you really want a fulfilled spiritual life, a productive and healthy Christian life, these are the 3 things that you have to deal with. So he starts with the first one. He says, you have to remember the brevity of life. Remember how short life really is. He says, show me, Lord, my life's end and the number of my days. I don't think he's saying, God, show me how I'm going to die and how many days I have left to that point. But rather, he's saying, give me an understanding of where I'm headed and what my life is going to be at the end. And then show me how to number my days so that when I get there, I'm ready to go. He's not just asking God exactly how many days would I have left, but he's saying, I want to make sure that I end well. And by the way, in the process of that, remind me day after day how fleeting, how quick, how short life really is. He goes on to say, you've made my days nothing more than a mere hand breadth. There are 2 ways to measure your hand length and your hand breadth. A hand breadth in the Hebrew culture was the smallest legal form of measurement. It's just the distance between one side of your hand and the other. He says, that's it. In terms of lifespans and the big picture of eternity, all of us here are nothing more than the width of a hand. The whole span of our years, that's it. That's it. Everyone is nothing more than a breath. Even for those who feel secure, who have lots of money, who have good health, who have a good education or portfolio, all we are is nothing more than a brief breath. Surely, everyone who goes around is nothing more than a phantom. In vain, people rush about heaping up wealth to enjoy without even knowing whose it's going to finally be. Isn't that interesting how we spend our lives in the pursuit of things that make our lives comfortable and fun? We have collections of this. We pursue this kind of a house or a car, all these things that are intended to make our life more comfortable. But in the end, it's either going to rust or it's going to end up in somebody else's yard sale. All right? If you don't believe me, watch American Pickers. All right? Mike and Frank are looking for your stuff right now. Oh, it's fun to enjoy and look at, but those things aren't going to last. And someday they're going, I'm going to be gone, and they're going to somebody. I have no idea who's going to get it. Doesn't really matter. And yet these things become so important because we forget how brief life is really all about. Over and over, the Bible reminds us of the brevity of life, the shortness of life. Job chapter 8, our days on earth are nothing more than a fleeting shadow. Isaiah 40, people are nothing more than grass. The grass grows, it's cut, it's gone, boom. The beauty of our lives is nothing more than a flower that grows and then it fades away. In 1 Chronicles 29, we're here only for a moment. We're nothing more than visitors or strangers. None of us, honestly, none of us own any of this. We're just borrowing it, okay? We're using it for a while. And we're in the land that our ancestors who came before us, they went through the whole process. They had it for a while, then they're gone, and it goes to somebody else. And our days on earth are nothing more than a passing shadow, gone so soon, without a trace. Without a trace. All right, I know this sounds odd, but professionally, I visit a lot of graveyards, all right? And I see all the stones that are there that represent people who once lived and they're gone without a trace. Nobody remembers them. Oh yeah, sometimes somebody writes something or they paint or they invent something that kind of impacts. But for the most part, every single person who lives will one day be gone and no one will remember them. And their tombstones give us the three most significant things: their birth date, their death date, and nothing more than a dash in between. That's it. My whole life is reduced to a dash. And so will yours. Really, your existence here, it's gone. It's done. Even if you live. And it's so interesting. David makes this point even stronger when he says in Psalm 90, 70 years. That's it for strength. I jokingly, a couple of weeks ago, I said, in 2 weeks, I'll turn 63, and I'll be beginning the second half of my life. But the reality is, I may not make it past 65. 70, that's about it for strong years. Some might live to 80 or 85. But God, remind us, teach us to realize the brevity of life, how short life really is, so that we will grow in wisdom, so that, as David is writing in Psalm 39, so that we'll be able to keep things in perspective. And as he's looking around at all of the ungodly and the things that they pursue and the lack of fulfillment that they really have, he says, Lord, if all of this is disappearing so quickly, if it's so fleeting, what am I going to look to for fulfillment, for meaning? Not to this stuff, not to other people, but rather, my hope is in you. You're the only one that can give my life meaning and purpose. You're the only one who can make sense of all of this. You're the only one that can bring true joy. But in order for me to have that kind of relationship with you, who is my creator and wants to be my friend, the only way that I can do that, and now David moves into the next teaching point, and he says, in order to experience that kind of life, you have to deal with the sin issues. See, God created us to know him. God created us to enjoy him. But we cannot do that when there is sin that separates us. And we're all sinners. We've all sinned. And God says, in order for you to experience real spiritual fulfillment and joy, prosperity in your life is to deal with the sin issues. And David, in the most emphatic, imperative tense commands, he says, God, save me from all of my transgressions. God, deliver me from my sin. Don't make me the scorn of fools. Remove your scourge from me, because I'm overcome by the blow of your hand. He says, God, I feel the separation. I feel the discipline. See, unresolved sin in our lives doesn't lead to a healthy, productive life. It only brings chaos and separation. Sin is a destructive element in my life. I'm missing the mark of God's holiness. I am falling short of what life can be if I'm willing to let God deal with this area in my life. Sometimes it's overt behavior. Sometimes it's just attitudes. But when we tolerate sin in our lives, it separates us and it consumes us. And God says, I have something so much better. Now, David is wrestling with this and saying, I need to have the sin resolved. And he says, when I was silent, I wouldn't open my mouth. You've done this. You've made me aware. You're dealing with me. David understands he has a sin issue in his life just like you and I do. David already made this clear in Psalm 38, verses 2 and 3, when he says, your arrows have pierced me. Your hand has come down on me because of my sin. And if there's somebody here today and there's an area in your life that you've been tolerating or pursuing wholeheartedly that is an area of sin, it's less than God's best for you. You're missing that mark of God's moral excellence. God would say, it's great that you appreciate how short life is, but before you're really going to be enabled to enjoy and move forward and grow and experience good spiritual health and prosperity in your life, you are going to have to let me deal with the sin issue. You're going to have to get rid of this thing that's in your life and holding you back. And so David cries out, hear my prayer. Imperative command, hear my prayer. Listen to my cry for help. Don't be deaf. God, I want to deal with this. And then he says this in the most interesting way. Look away from me so that I can enjoy my life again before I die and I'm gone. Now, when was the last time we thought, the real enjoyment of my life comes because God is looking away from me? And what David is doing is using an idiom, or a figure of speech here, that's no different than the idioms that we use here in English and in America. I'll explain. When I was a kid in high school, I used to go out on the weekends and hang out with my friends, and I always had a curfew. My mom and dad said, okay, on school nights, you got to be home by this night. On a weeknight, it was going to be 11:30 or 12. And so I would go out with my pals, and we'd have fun, bowl, whatever. And then I would come home, and if I was late, I always knew what to expect when I came home late. I would walk in the door, at the back door in the den, and there was my mom sitting there in this white rocking chair we had right in the corner. And I would walk in, and I might be a half hour late, and she would just look at me, and she gave me the eye. All right? Have you ever gotten the eye from a mom or a dad? And she didn't even have to say a word. She just gave me the eye. And you're late. I know. Okay, Mom, it's getting really late. I really got to get to bed, kind of thing. And then the second thing she'd do is say, Steve, come here and kiss me goodnight. I am not kidding you. Come here, give me a kiss. My mom did not want to kiss me. She wanted to smell my breath, all right? I knew what was going on every time. I don't have to say anything more, all right? But it would kill me when she would give me the eye. And David is saying exactly the same thing. God, when he says, look away, stop giving me the eye. God doesn't even say anything. He's just looking at David, and David knows it. He feels the pressure. He feels the conviction. He says, stop giving me the eye so that I can be free of this sense of guilt and free to be able to move forward again. Because And here's that brevity of life thing, because it's not going to last. I'm going to die, and I want to know how to die well. Now, let's just be clear here. The same struggle that David had 3,000 years ago is the same struggle that you and I deal with today, every day in our lives. Paul writes in Romans 3 that all of us have sinned, not just once or in the past, but he writes in the present tense verb and says we have sinned and continually fall short of the moral excellence of God. We all still struggle with a sin issue because we all have an old sin nature inside of us. Now, because that sin nature is there, we can choose to respond and deal with it in one of two ways. We can either fight it or we embrace it. For those who embrace, we just tolerate it and say, oh, it's not that big a deal, it doesn't matter. Or we pursue it and say, yeah, I'm going to do this just because I want it. And then all the chaos and pain it brings. But God says, deal with the sin issue. Don't embrace it. Don't just tolerate it, but fight it. In fact, in Romans 6, he gives us this same sense of imperative command when he says, don't let sin control you any longer. Don't let sin control the way you think or you live. Don't give in to sinful desires because they're destructive. It's less than God's best. You'll never experience fulfillment, spiritual health, and prosperity by giving into sin. Fight it. Don't let any part of your body become an instrument of sin. Instead, step back. Give yourselves completely to God so that you can experience and live out the prosperity and the health of this new life that God has for you. And use your whole body every single day. Say, God, okay, I may stumble, but I am not going to run after sin. I'm not going to just tolerate it and say it doesn't matter. I am choosing to deal with the sin issue by giving myself completely to you as an instrument for your glory. And that's when we do that, then we experience glory in our lives. But you absolutely cannot experience glory if you're pursuing sin. It just can't happen. So, we have the first step to getting there is recognize how short life really is, the brevity of life. Second step in experiencing spiritual health and prosperity is deal with the sin issue. But then he ties it all together by giving us a whole new focus. He says, here's the third step in having a spiritually healthy and prosperous life, and that's keep an eternal focus. And he does that in the most interesting way. A simple sentence says it all. When in verse 12 he says, I'm living here like a foreigner. I'm nothing more than a stranger. Again, I don't own any of this. I'm just a temporary dweller here, as were all of my ancestors. And now he ties in the brevity of life. They've all come, they've all gone, and I'm going to be just like them. I'm here just for a short time. I saw this picture, I thought, that's exactly what David's communicating. I'm nothing more than a backpacker in this life. I got a few things on my back, and I'm trudging through. Some days are easy, some days are hard, some days I'm going downhill and it's smooth, some days I'm fighting against the hill, but it doesn't matter. I'm only here for a time because I have a different home. This world is a comfortable and sometimes fun place, but it's not my home. My home is in heaven. In fact, Peter takes this very principle and he ties it to the church, to you and me in 1 Peter chapter 2, when he uses exactly the same terms. He says, dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and strangers, and the word stranger in the Greek simply means as temporary residents. We're only here for a little while. Make your life count. And because I have an eternal focus rather than a self-focus or a culture focus, now when I'm thinking, okay, if I'm going to be with God forever, I'm leaving all of this stuff and all these people behind. Yes, there will be a great reunion someday in heaven, but all of these things are just temporary. That means that I need to focus on God. I need to pursue Him. It's not that it's evil or wrong to have nice things, but I don't live for them. And if they're all gone, they're gone. It doesn't matter, because ultimately the only thing that matters is what my relationship with God looks like. He is the only thing that's eternal. And he's the only one who can bring eternal meaning and fulfillment and purpose into my life. So I pursue him. And what I do to serve him. And whether it's here in the church, whether it's helping people in my neighborhood, my family, my workplace, at school, whatever it might be, as I'm doing these things for him, those things are the things that are going to have eternal meaning and purpose. Having an eternal focus affects every part of my life. It affects how I spend my time, how I build relationships, how I spend my money. Everything is changed when I realize that in this life, in this world, I'm nothing more than a foreigner and a temporary resident. That's it. That's why Paul, again, in the imperative command tense, says, don't live as citizens of this world, but choose to live as citizens of heaven. Choose to live as citizens of heaven. All right, so if I were to ask you to raise your hand, I'm not, but if I were to ask you to raise your hand, how many of you want to have a productive, healthy, and prosperous spiritual life? I would hope that every one of us would raise our hands. That's what God wants for you. That's what God wants for you. And he says, if you want that kind of life, these are the three things you're going to have to do. You're going to have to remember how short life really is. You're going to have to deal with the sin issue. And you're going to have to change your focus so that it's eternal. Now, for most of us in this process of our journey, discipleship and transformation, these things kind of happen and they develop, but sometimes God allows something so significant into our lives that it just kind of jolts the whole system. And we have to learn all three of these principles, boom, just almost immediately. And that happened to a guy named Eric Lamarck. Now, I don't know, does anybody know who Eric Lamarck is? Have you ever heard of him? All right, a couple have. All right, so here's the story of Eric Lamarck. There are two things that stand out about Eric's life. The first was, as a young person, he was one of the best student hockey players in all of America. But the second thing that stands out about Eric Lamarck's life is that he has one of the greatest survivor stories in all of history. It's incredible. Now, if you've never heard or read his autobiography, you can see the whole story of his life in the movie called Six Below. And I just watched it this last week, and it's pretty incredible. As a hockey player, he grew up in California in the 80s. In high school, he was such a good hockey player that all of the scouts were watching him, just waiting for him to graduate, hoping that they could recruit him either to go to their college and play hockey or even on the professional side. He decided when he graduated from high school that he wanted an education, so he went to Northern Michigan University, where he played for the Wildcats. But at 17 years old, he was signed on by the Boston Bruins to play for them. He was so good. The problem was he had this thing where he knew he was so good, he was so arrogant, so proud, that he was fired from the Bruins. He ended up going to Europe, where he played professionally. And the high point of his hockey career was when he played in 1994 for France at the Olympics. But Eric had one, besides his character of pride, he had one thing that just was killing him, actually. He was hooked on crystal meth. Some friends got him into this. He was smoking crystal meth. It affected his hockey, it affected his whole attitude, destroyed his hockey career. But he loved the rush of playing hockey, of being on the ice, of, the action involved. And when he was done with hockey, he said, I'm going to find something else. And so he took up a new hobby that gave him just as much of a sense of rush, and that was snowboarding. He went everywhere snowboarding they could. He was one of those guys who tried everything just because he was addicted to the rush. And so he and some friends decided to go to the Mammoth Mountain and then do some snowboarding at the Mammoth Towers in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. After a full day of snowboarding down the mountain on the approved hills, there was a huge storm coming in. They decided for the safety of the skiers and snowboarders, they were going to close the mountain. But Eric, in his self-independent pride, said, it doesn't matter. I'm going to go down one more time. And this time, instead of taking the approved hills, he decided to go off into a closed area that had no business anyone being on. He said, but I can do it. I can do this. And he took off down the mountain on his snowboard by himself. I'm not a big snowboarder, all right? So I would think if you just told me he was going down, I think, okay, gravity alone should pull him to the bottom. But he got into a situation where it was a whiteout and he couldn't see. In fact, he hit a point that he was level and he was trying to figure out and he got lost. No way to figure out up, down, left, right. And he started wandering. Up to that point, no one had ever survived out in the cold there for more than 2 days. And Eric was absolutely lost. In fact, he was lost for 7 days. No one had ever been out there for 7 days before. And at one point, as he was walking around, he accidentally got onto some thin ice. And it's bad enough he's dealing with the cold and the weather, and all of a sudden the ice gives through and he's completely drenched with ice water. And he's got to survive that. He found his way to the top of a mountain after 7 days. And for the first 5 days, it's so interesting as you read his story. He writes and says, people asked him, did you find God on the mountain? And he says, no, I found the angel of death. And it took him 5 days. He was so independent and so strong. He says, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make it. It was 5 days before he even prayed and said, all right, God. And what's really interesting about his life is that when he was younger in high school, he prayed to ask Jesus into his heart, but then it meant nothing. Nobody taught him what that life should look like or how it should be lived. He said, I was living full-blown sin, pursuing that, and God put him in the most severe situation to remind him of the brevity of life and how empty sin is. And after 5 days, he finally started praying. God, I need you to help me. I need you to help me. Another 2 days before he made it to the top of a mountain where he was rescued by a rescue helicopter. When they went out looking for him, they said, this isn't a rescue, this is a recovery. After this whole event was over, he was so frostbitten that they had to remove both of his legs. But God was working. God was dealing with Eric. In fact, in his testimony, he said after he got out of the hospital, I went to church in a wheelchair. And there, at the end of the service, knowing that God had spared his life and was calling Eric to himself, Eric wheeled up to the front of the church when there was an altar call made. He got out of the chair with no legs. He says, I got on my knees, and I just started praying, giving thanks to God, asking the Lord to come into my heart, and really received it. Brevity of life, sin issues, and now eternal focus. He says, my life was changed. For the last several decades, he's been living this life as a follower of Jesus, going to churches, schools, different organizations, sharing his testimony. He writes and says, the longest anyone had ever survived had been 2 nights on those mountains in that condition, but I survived 7. And there's a reason that I'm here. Here's where the eternal focus is. I'm here to glorify God now. And I found a praise in my heart. I found a transformation in my life. Listen to this. He says, if you don't have Christ, you're missing out. You're missing out on really living your life, a life that is filled with meaning and purpose, a life that is healthy and spiritually prosperous. If you're not pursuing Christ by dealing with the temporary nature of life, getting rid of the sin issues, and now having a focus, you're missing out. He says, I'm somebody who's achieved all these worldly dreams, and all of those dreams were nothing more than a shadow, a vapor without Christ. Now I have Christ, and I'm alive. I am more alive than I've ever been. I feel like I can run, I can dance, I am richer than I ever was. That's the difference it makes when you recognize the brevity of life, when you're willing to deal with the sin issues, and you have an eternal focus. That's the life that God is calling each of us to live. In fact, in the strongest terms, Paul says, if you want that kind of life, if you want to experience that kind of fulfillment and growth, then you have to live the life that's worthy of your calling. Live the life that's worthy of your calling. Let me pull all this together with one simple statement. That is, it does not matter to me how long my life is. It doesn't matter how long my life is, but rather how I live that life. That's all that matters. Now I'm going to ask you to bow your heads for just a moment. This morning, maybe God's speaking to you. He's challenging you and encouraging you. He's saying, listen, I have a quality and a life for you that is better than anything you could have ever imagined or dreamed of. But the only way you're going to experience that is by listening to David as he shared those 3 teaching points. Recognize the brevity of life, deal with the sin issues, and now have an eternal focus. I don't do this often, but